Hi, everyone. Looks like we only have about half the class here, but we're going to start regardless. Just a reminder before we get going um, that exam one is 1 week from today. So make sure you are prepared for that. I am going to be posting a study guide. I'll try to get to that by tomorrow at the latest. I'll be posting that on Canvas. It'll be in the module section. So take a look at that. Remember, I gave you a tip for how to use a study guide in a prior class. Remember that what I encourage you to do is not to do this. The first thing, what I don't want you to do is to immediately go to the study guide and then answer each individual question by going to your notes and figuring out what the answer is. Partly because the questions I ask in the study guide are not going to be the questions that are on the exam. Okay, so it kind of gives you a false impression of whether you know the material. Furthermore, because of the hindsight bias that we talked about earlier this semester, you know that once you know the outcome of something, it feels as if you could have always come up with that. You could have foreseen that outcome. In other words, once you know what the answer to a question is, it feels like you could have come up with an answer on your own. So what that means is people often go into the exams thinking they know material when actually they don't know it as well as they think they do. So what I encourage you to do instead is don't even look at the study guide until you have actually studied, until you've gone through your notes, until you've read the chapters in the textbook. Once you feel like you understand the material, then put all your notes away, open up the study guide, and see if you can answer those questions without going to your notes. If you can't, that just means you have to study that section more. Okay, that's how I recommend that you use the study guide for this exam. We are going to, we're talking about the self today. And we're going to talk about the self on Tuesday as well. We should get to the end of that section, or at least close to the end of that section. Hopefully we'll finish it by then, by the end of Tuesday's class. Whatever we get to by the end of Tuesday's class is what you're responsible for exam one. So hopefully we'll get through the self, so you'll be responsible for research methods in the self. That means that you are responsible for chapters 1 and chapters 2 in the textbook. And that's regardless of which edition you have. Chapters 1 and 2 are the 2 chapters you need to know for the exam. And there probably will be at least a couple questions that are taken from the textbook that we have not gone over in class. Okay. I think if there's any other questions you have about the exam, feel free to write in the chat and I can answer whatever other questions that you have. But if you recall, the exams are 30 multiple choice questions. And I'll give you a few more details on Tuesday in Tuesday's class about how exactly the exam is going to work. I'm playing around with a couple different options of how to deliver the exam. So I'm going to figure this out over the weekend. I'll let you know on Tuesday exactly how that's going to work. Also, we will have a top hat quiz, not today, but on Tuesday's class, we will have a top hat quiz. So make sure you come prepared for that. And speaking of Top Hat, we're not going to have a quiz right now, but I do have a question for you that I would like you to answer on Top Hat. So if you can log into your account, that would be great. And I have one quick question. We're going to come back to this question later on this class. But I want to get your responses now. So I want you to imagine that there's a hypothetical scenario that there are 2 different worlds. Okay, so I want you to imagine this. These 2 worlds are identical in every respect except for one. And that's this. So in world A, whatever you do, whatever your career is, you make $50,000 per year doing it. Everyone else in the world makes $25,000 per year. In world B, you make $100,000 per year, and everyone else makes $250,000 per year. Everything else is identical between these 2 worlds, including prices and things like that. So given this choice you have between these 2 worlds that you can choose to live in, which world do you prefer, world A or world B? I want to give you a few seconds to give me a response to this. Okay. I'm not going to look at what these answers are now. We'll come back and see how people respond a little later. But for now, what I would like to do is continue talking about the self. And I've got a few questions to ask you before we get into lecture. Yes, and by the way, answering someone in the chat, yes, the test will be during class. It will be Thursday from 3:30 to 5. Yeah. So I've got a couple questions for you before I start lecturing. And feel free to type in your responses in the chat to these questions. First off, why did you come to Florida International University? Why did you come to FIU as opposed to any other school you could have gone to for undergrad? What was it that drew you here? I'm going to wait for some people to write answers in the chat. Okay, it's close to you, close to home. Okay, scholarships, affordable, looks good on resume, like the school. Okay, it looks like the two most common answers seem to be it was affordable, and the number one answer seems to be because it was close to home or it was convenient or something like that. And I'm sure you guys meant to say the quality of the academic programs, it's going to set you up for a good career. I'm sure you meant to say that and forgot. But let's just say, okay, it's close to home and affordable. Okay, whatever, that'll work. A couple more questions for you. Let's say you're in a dating relationship. Or if you're not, then if you were to be in a dating relationship, why did you fall in love with your partner? Or what would lead you to fall in love with someone? Okay, lots of personality. What about their personality? Make you feel special, the way they treat others, sense of humor, his smell. Okay, that's good, sure. Caring, compatible, kindness, humor and intelligence. Okay, those are all reasonable answers. One more question. Why do you like Coke over Pepsi if you like Coke over Pepsi? Or vice versa, why do you like Pepsi over Coke if that's your preference? Pepsi tastes smoother to you. It's sweeter. Pepsi tastes better. Coke's more refreshing. Okay. Pepsi's bubblier, sweeter. Okay. So again, all reasonable arguments. Do you know in blind taste tests which one wins, Coke or Pepsi? I mean, really, it's going to vary depending on the blind taste test and things like that. But there is at least one blind taste test that shows that the sort of preferred cola that people have is actually RC cola, not Coke or Pepsi. Now, I'm sure you can find all sorts of taste tests where Coke will win, Pepsi will win, and some where RC will win. But who here has a preference for RC cola over Coke or Pepsi? Or maybe another question, do you know what RC cola even is? And you can find it. If you go to Publix in Miami, you can find RC cola. So it does exist. You can buy it. Anyone have a preference for RC cola? Let me change the question a little bit. Given that RC cola exists, and given that many people prefer to Coke or Pepsi, why don't you? Why do you drink Coke or Pepsi and not RC cola? You never tried RC cola? Why not though? Maybe that's the question. Why haven't you tried RC cola? Ah, okay, so Nicole has an answer. So they're more advertised, right? You see ads for Coke and for Pepsi. Probably, I'm assuming most of you have never seen an ad for RC Cola. You may not have even known it existed, right? So what that means is maybe one reason for why you have the soft drink preferences that you have is not only because of the taste, but because of advertising, right? You're influenced, in other words, by advertising. I mean, obviously we're influenced by advertising. That's why these companies spend millions and millions and millions of dollars per year. They're not doing that if it doesn't exist, if it doesn't work, right? It obviously works. But what's sort of interesting is that no one seems to think that they're influenced by advertising. If you ask people, they usually say, yeah, I can see how other people would be influenced by advertising, but not me. I make my decisions independently of advertising. Now, everyone thinks that though, right? So that's kind of nonsense. We're all influenced by advertising to various degrees. And yet, when I asked you why you had a preference for Coke or Pepsi, I don't think anyone actually mentioned that advertising might have played a role. But we know that advertising plays a role. So in other words, one of the reasons that we know affects people's choices and their preferences, which is advertising, people seem to be almost completely oblivious or unaware that they are affected by advertising. And what I'm going to make, or the argument I'm going to make over the rest of the class, is that that general principle is true when you're answering these other types of questions as well. What I'm going to argue is that it's easy to come up with answers for why you came to FIU, or why you fell in love with the person you fell in love with, or why you prefer Coke over Pepsi, or vice versa. It's easy to come up with those responses. What I'm going to argue, though, is that the responses you often come up with are not actual true reasons why you came to FIU or why you fell in love with the person you fell in love with. I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong. You might be right to some degree or another. But the point is that they're not necessarily correct. And I'm going to argue that that's because you don't really know yourself as well as you think you do. Kind of a counterintuitive sort of idea, but I'm going to try to convince you of this over the next little while. So what we're going to be talking about for the next little while is how we come to know ourselves. So at the very end of last class, we talked about a self-concept, right? Which is the sum total of everything you think about yourself. And the question is, how do you come to form that self-concept? So last class, when I asked you to fill in the blank, I am whatever, and you had to fill it in with a word or a phrase. And if you filled it in with personality traits, which most people did, then how do you know you have that personality trait? If you said you're honest or generous or trustworthy, how do you know that you are those things? And we're going to talk about 4 different possible ways that we might be able to form a self-concept. So these are the 4 ways that we're going to talk about. We're going to start by talking about what seems to be the most obvious of the 4, which is through an introspection process. By introspection, I mean you just sort of go inside yourself and you pull out this idea. If you say that you're honest, it's because you know inherently at a deep internal level, you know you're an honest person, so you just say you're honest. You just kind of inherently know it. Let's talk about introspection a little bit. It is clear that we often know the outcome of our cognitive processes. What I mean by this is that if I ask you if you have a preference for Coke or Pepsi, you know if you have a preference for Coke or Pepsi. If, like, you know you came to FIU, you know you are in love with your partner, you know the outcome of these processes. But what I'm going to argue is that even though you know the outcome of these processes, you don't always know how you got there. You don't know the reasons that led you to that outcome. You don't know necessarily the reasons why you came to FIU. You might, but you may not. You don't necessarily know the reasons why you fell in love with your partner, or the reasons that you prefer Coke or Pepsi or whatever soft drink it is. This is what I'm going to argue. However, when you ask people these things, they readily will give you explanations for their behavior. There was one person, I think, when I asked, why'd you fall in love with your partner? I think the first answer was, we don't really know, which is actually a great answer. I don't recommend you give that answer if your partner asks you why you love them. It's probably not great to say, I don't know, I have no idea. Don't say that. But it might be the most truthful response that you can actually give. But it's very, very rare that people give that response. Almost no one says, I don't know. They will give you explanations. But what I'm going to argue is that the explanations that they give you are oftentimes completely incorrect. In other words, people are just almost making stuff up and not even realizing they're making stuff up. Let me give you a little bit of empirical data from social psychology studies to try to make this point. Okay? And the first general point I want to make is that sometimes people overemphasize the influence of certain factors on their behavior. Meaning, if you ask them, why did you fall in love with this person? Why did you do this? They will claim that something influenced them when in fact it didn't influence them at all. Let me give you a couple examples. This was a study done a while ago where participants were told that over the course of about 2 weeks to keep a diary. And the diary just keeps track of their mood on a day-to-day basis. So sometimes you're feeling good, sometimes you're feeling a little down, et cetera, et cetera. After this 2-week period, so for every day, participants report their mood. They bring this diary into the lab and they give it to the researcher. And the researcher says, we're looking at people's moods over time. And we know, though, that the weather can influence people's moods. And so we want to make sure we factor out that factor from our analysis. So let me ask you a question. Did the weather over the past couple of weeks affect your mood? Were you happier on sunny days and you were more depressed on rainy days? And the majority of people, almost everybody says, well, yeah, the weather affected my mood. Of course, I'm happier when it's sunny and nice out, and I'm sadder when it's storming and raining and things like that. So almost everyone says, yes, of course, the weather affected my mood. But what the researchers had done is they kept track of the weather every day over the prior 2 weeks. And so they can correlate what the weather was like with participants' own reports of what their moods were that day. And when they look at that, what they find is that contrary to what participants said, people were no more happier on sunny days than they were on rainy days. In other words, there was no relationship whatsoever between what the weather was and what people's moods were. But people claim that they were affected by the weather, even though objectively they didn't seem to be at all. In other words, they were overemphasizing the influence that the weather had on their own mood. Well, that's kind of curious. Let's look at another study. In this study, participants watched a short film under one of two conditions. So half of the participants were randomly assigned to a condition where they watched this movie within a room that in which there was an adjacent room in which there was this really noisy power saw going off during the time they're watching the movie. The second group of participants were randomly assigned to a condition in which they watched the exact same movie, except there was no noisy power saw going off in the next room. Everybody at the end of the movie were then asked to rate how much they enjoyed the movie. And they had a scale that they can rate this on. And people in the power saw condition, in the condition where they overheard this noisy power saw going on, were then instructed, look, we know that there's this noisy power saw, they're doing construction over there. We know that can influence people's ratings. So let me just ask you, did that influence your rating? Did you like the movie more or less because of that power saw? Like, what would you have told, what rating, how much would you have liked this movie if that power saw wasn't going off? And most people in that condition said, you know what? Yes, that power saw influenced me. I would have liked the movie a lot more had there not been a noisy power saw going off. But here's the thing. We can compare their ratings for how much they said they liked the movie to people who were in the condition in which the noisy power saw wasn't going off, right? So if people were accurate, if the noisy power saw really did lead them to like the movie less, their rating should be lower than people in the control condition who never heard the power saw in the first place. But when the researchers look at these ratings, what they find is that, if anything, the people who in the condition where they overheard the noisy power saw gave slightly higher ratings to the movie than people who were in the control condition. In other words, people believed that this noisy power saw led them to dislike the movie, but in fact, it didn't at all. It had no effect, basically, virtually no effect on their preferences. So again, we see a situation where people were overemphasizing the influence of some factor, in this case, a noisy power saw, on their preference for liking this movie. So people are thinking something influenced them that in fact didn't influence them at all. But it's not just that people overemphasize the influence of certain factors. People often do the exact opposite sometimes. Sometimes they underemphasize the influence of some factors in their behavior. In other words, in some cases, people will say that something didn't influence them that we know in fact did influence them. I'll give you an example of one of these types of studies. This is a study where researchers went to a shopping mall and they had a table and they stopped random people who were shopping in this mall and said, we're doing some marketing research. We've got 4 pairs of pantyhose laid out. Now, they weren't in their boxes or anything. They're just kind of laid out. And if you would mind going through them and taking a look at them, feel free to touch them if you want, and just get a sense of which pair you prefer. Which pantyhose do you like and why? Give me some feedback, some market research feedback, basically. Now, what the participants didn't know is that these 4 pairs of pantyhose were completely identical. They were exactly the same. But they don't know this, right? So these participants start off and they feel a pair of pantyhose and they stretch it a little bit and they get a sense of it. They move on to the next one, do the same thing. And at the end, when the researchers ask them which pair of pantyhose do you prefer, for whatever reason, people tend to prefer the last one that they touched. For whatever reason, there's some sort of order effect here. Now, we know they can't really prefer that one because it's exactly the same as all the other pairs, but for whatever reason, people prefer the last one that they touched. So the researchers then asked them, why did you pick that pair of pantyhose? Why do you prefer that one? And what did these people say? Well, when I touched it, it felt like a better quality material. It stretched a little better. I don't think there's going to be as many runs. I like the color a little bit better. It's softer. They give all sorts of reasons that are complete nonsense because they're exactly the same pair of pantyhose. So right away, we're seeing that people are overemphasizing the influence of quality and things like that on their decisions because these things couldn't have affected their decisions, right? But what's also interesting is that the researchers then say, some people seem to prefer the last pair of pantyhose that they touch. There's some sort of order effect. Do you think that could have influenced you? Do you think that you were influenced by the order in which the pantyhose were laid out? And what do these people say? Absolutely not. There's no way that the order would have affected which pair of pantyhose I would like. We know that it did, of course, in many cases, but no one ever says that it did. So what's happening is that people are underemphasizing the influence that the order in which they touched pantyhose had on their preferences. It's almost as if people had no idea why they preferred this pair of pantyhose. So what's going on here? Well, what research tends to suggest is that when people give explanations or reasons for why they like something, the explanations that they give are not the result of this deep introspection where they're pulling out the true reasons, but rather they seem to be based on common sense ideas. In other words, if you ask people why do they like a pair of pantyhose, well, it makes sense that you would prefer a pair of pantyhose because of the color and the texture and because of the quality of the material. And so that's what people tend to report. It doesn't really make sense that the order in which you touch the pantyhose would matter, right? So people claim that doesn't matter. Similarly, when you ask people, did the weather affect your mood? Well, it makes sense that the weather would affect our mood, so people report that it does. And it makes sense that a noisy power saw would have affected my liking of the movie, so people report that it did. In other words, what happens is that when you ask people, why did you prefer this thing? Why did you like or dislike this thing? The explanations they come up with are explanations that sound good, but aren't necessarily the actual reasons for what led them to prefer those things. Similarly, if I ask you, why did you fall in love with your partner? The reasons people tend to give for this are reasons that sound like real reasons people might fall in love with someone. Sense of humor, intelligence, personality, they're kind, they're giving. These are all reasons that make sense. And maybe that contributed to it, but maybe not. Maybe there were other factors that also led you to fall in love with this person that you're just simply unaware of and weren't able to come up with. And now the issue here is not only that we don't know the causes of our behavior or the reasons for our preferences, but another problem is that we don't know that we don't know. In other words, it feels like we know the true reason why we fell in love with our partner. I mean, obviously, I fell in love with them because of these personality characteristics. What we don't realize is that the reasons we're giving are kind of reasons that we're making up in a sense. And maybe they happen to be correct, but they're not necessarily correct. And we might be missing out on the real reasons for why we like something. But in fact, I can go a step farther. Because it's not only the case that we don't know or we aren't aware of the reasons for our preferences. But what research has shown is that if you make people think about why they like something, that leads them to make worse decisions. Not only is introspection useless, in other words, it can be worse than useless. It can lead you to the exact wrong conclusion. Let me give you some examples of these studies. In this first study, participants had to simply taste a series of jams and then give a rating for why they liked, or sorry, a rating for how much they liked each jam. But participants were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. Half of the participants simply, or I guess I should say, half of the participants would taste the jam, and then they were asked to give reasons for why they liked or disliked that jam. I liked how much sugar was in it, or I liked the texture, or whatever it was. Then they rated the jam, and they repeated that process for a series of jams. That's half the participants. The other half of the participants simply tasted the jam and then simply rated it. They were never asked to give reasons for their preferences. So in other words, what the researchers did is they made half of the people introspect and give reasons for why they like the jams, and the other half did not introspect. Then what the researchers did is they took the ratings that participants gave of the jams and they compared them to the ratings of professional taste testers. And what they showed, interestingly, is that among people who did not introspect, who didn't give reasons for why they liked the jam or not, they just simply tasted it and rated it, their ratings matched up, they correlated pretty well with the ratings of professional taste testers. But if you look at the other participants, the participants who were asked to introspect and give reasons for why they liked each jam, their ratings suddenly had no relationship to the ratings of professional taste testers. In other words, it's as if the act of introspecting, the act of thinking about why they liked the jams, led these people to not know if they liked the jams. Very counterintuitive, right? But this is just jam tasting, right? I mean, who really cares about people's ratings of jams? So what the researchers did is they conducted a follow-up study looking at something else. It was basically the idea of the study is exactly the same, except instead of having people rate jams, they instead rated their romantic partners. So here's what they did. Participants come into their lab, and half of them have to give reasons for why they like their dating partner. So every participant is in a dating relationship, right? So half the participants give reasons. Why do you like your partner? Well, I like them because they have a sense of humor and they're intelligent and they're kind and their personality and blah, blah, blah. The other students, the other half of the students, did not give reasons for why they like their dating partner. Okay? And then everybody rated how satisfied they were in the relationship. Now, what the researchers did is they followed up with these participants over the course of the next few months. And in that time, some of these couples broke up and some of them stayed together. Well, if you look first off at people in the control condition, so people who never, when they showed up for the lab, they never gave reasons for why they liked their partner. All they did was rate how satisfied they were in the relationship. Well, you can use those satisfaction ratings to predict whether that couple would stay together or break up. So in other words, probably not surprisingly, if people said they were really satisfied in the relationship, they tended to stay together over the next few months. If they said they were unsatisfied, they tended to break up. So those satisfaction ratings were in fact related to whether they stayed together or broke up, as you might expect. But what's particularly interesting here is that the other participants, the participants who gave reasons for why they liked their partner, and only then rated how satisfied they were in the relationship, those satisfaction ratings were no longer associated with whether they stayed together or broke up over the next few months. Okay? In other words, the act of having people think about why they liked their partner led them to not know how satisfied they were with their partner. Again, it's sort of like what we found with the jam study, right? But this seems sort of weird because what this is showing, what these two studies are showing, is that when you make people think about why they like something, that leads them to not know if they like that thing anymore. Why would that be the case? What's going on here? Oops. Well, effectively what's going on here is that if I ask you why you like, let's say, your dating partner, I want you to give me reasons. The reasons that you give me, by definition, have to be verbalizable, things that you can put into words. It's easy to describe someone's personality, right? They're intelligent, they're funny, they're whatever. It's easy to do that. So those are very verbalizable things. But the real reason that you like someone is not simply based on these personality characteristics. That could play a role, but it's not only based on that. There's a certain chemistry you have with people that's really hard to put into words. And so when I ask you, why do you love this person? You can't put into words that you have this just indescribable chemistry because you can't describe it, right? So you list personality characteristics. But that's not the real reason you like them. So when you list these personality characteristics, what's happening is that when I then ask you how satisfied are you in the relationship, you start relying on that information, the personality characteristics, the things that aren't really associated with why you actually love that person. In other words, you're relying on the wrong information. People in the control condition, the people who are not asked to verbalize reasons, if I ask them, how satisfied are you in the relationship? They just kind of sense their gut. Are they happy in the relationship or not? And that is the best predictor of whether they're going to stay together. It's just if they're happy in their gut, not if they're thinking about the personality characteristics that the person has. Okay, or think about it this way. Let's imagine that you're dating someone and they look fantastic on paper, right? They are good looking, they're successful, they're ambitious, they're funny, they have all sorts of characteristics, like you don't really have chemistry with them, right? I mean, I'm sure that happens all the time with people. And if I ask you, why do you love this person? It's easy to list off 20 reasons why you love this person, right? All those qualities they have. And then I ask you, how satisfied are you in the relationship? And you think, well, I've listed off like 20 reasons why I must be really satisfied in this relationship. But deep down, you're not, because you don't have that chemistry. So by making you think about the reasons you love them, you start relying on the wrong information, only the information you were able to verbalize. You start ignoring the chemistry. As a consequence, it's like you don't know if you like them anymore. On the other hand, maybe you do have chemistry with this one person, but on paper, they don't look that good. They're not all that good looking. They're not all that intelligent. They're not all that funny. They're definitely not generous, but you just have that chemistry with them. And again, if I ask you, tell me reasons, why do you love this person? You start, oh my God, I don't know. I can't think of any positive characteristics they have. It becomes hard to list anything, right? Now I ask you, how satisfied are you in the relationship? You think, well, I couldn't even come up with like a single quality that I think they're amazing. So I guess I'm not really satisfied in this relationship. But in reality, you are, because you have that non-verbalizable chemistry with them. So again, what's happened is you start relying on the wrong information, and that screws up your decision making. What this means overall is that when you're trying to decide how much you like something, the best thing you can do is to go with your gut. If you overthink it, you start relying on the wrong information. And that's what's happening here. And I would argue that's what's happened, or that tends to be what happens when people answer the following questions like you did at the beginning of this class. All right, you start relying on verbalizable information. And as we saw with the Coke and Pepsi example, there's some things that actually influence you, such as advertising, that can influence your preferences, that you don't think about when I ask you why you have those preferences. So you start relying on the wrong information. Okay, well, this brings up a practical question, which is this. Let's say you have a decision between two things. Maybe it's, if you're lucky, which of these two people that really want to date me, which of these two people should I date, right? Well, one strategy people have for making this type of decision is to make a list of pros and cons, right? All the pros and cons of each option and seeing which list is longer and just making the decision that way. That's a natural thing that I think a lot of people do. So the question is, should you make a list of pros and cons to make this decision? And what I would argue is that that is maybe the worst possible strategy you could possibly use to make that decision. You are much better off going with your gut than to make a pros and cons list. And the reason is because, for the reasons we just talked about, when you make a pros and cons list, you can only list things that are by definition verbalizable. So you can't list the real things, the real reasons why you might like something, the sort of gut feeling you have that's just hard to put into words. So you start relying on the wrong information to make your decision. Relying on no information, or at least no explicit information, is much better than trying to come up with a pros and cons list. Now, this is true, and I want to make this clear, this is only true for effective decisions, meaning when you're deciding which thing you prefer or how much you like something. When the question is how much you like something, going with your gut is usually better than overanalyzing those things, because your brain is not aware of the reason for why your gut likes something a lot of the time. If we're talking about more cognitive-based decisions, logical decisions, maybe it's like, which of these two stocks is more likely to make money for me in the long run? Well, that's a more cognitive decision. You want to think about that, right? You want to have good reasons for investing in which of these two stocks. But for preferences, your gut is much better than your brain at knowing what you like. So I would argue that based on this type of research, that introspection is not a really good way that we have of knowing about ourselves. But if that's the case, then how do we come to know about ourselves? So I'm going to talk about 3 other methods. And so the question is, what do you mean by gut? By gut, I just mean your natural feeling. So if you're deciding which of 2 people do you like better, what is your immediate gut reaction? What is your immediate reaction to whether you like someone without thinking about it? That's what I mean. Okay? It's just your natural inclination. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is a second process that we might use in order to learn about ourselves, which is a process known as social comparison. Social comparison theory was something that was devised in the 1950s. It is one of the most famous theories in social psychology. It's something that's going to come back later on in the course. We're going to see this come back a few more times in the course. But it's really, really important for understanding people. Here's the basic idea. Well, actually, before I do that, let me ask you a question. Let's say that on exam one, so next week, when you take exam one, you get an 84% on the exam. And my question to you is, are you happy with that score? And maybe I'll give you a little bit more information. Let's say that everybody else got 95% on the exam. Are you happy with your 84%? My guess is no, probably not, right? But let me give you this. So let's say you get 84% on the exam, but everyone else gets 50% on the exam. Are you happy with that score? Well, yeah, maybe. Maybe you are happy, right? Now, what this means is that your happiness or your self evaluation depends not only on your score, but also on the score of everybody else. Because an 84% could be a very good thing in some contexts and a very bad thing in other contexts, depending on how everyone else did, right? So what that means is that you evaluate yourself. So in this specific example, you evaluate your ability to understand social psychology in relation to other people. And that's basically the crux of social comparison theory, is that we understand ourselves not just in terms of how well we do at something, but in terms of how well we do at something in relation to how well other people do at that same thing. We compare ourselves to others. This is why when you get an exam back, one of the first things you want to know is what was the average in the class? Because you want to know, how did you do in relation to everybody else? So we evaluate ourselves. We come to learn about ourselves through a social comparison process between us and other people. So when do we do this? When do we engage in social comparison? Well, we don't always compare ourselves to other people. So if you take someone like LeBron James, one of the best basketball players to ever play the game, right? And you ask them, how good are you at basketball? LeBron James doesn't have to think, well, let's see, I'm better than these people here, and so I think I'm pretty good. He knows he's really good, right? But under situations where it's sort of uncertain, where we're not really sure how well we're doing at something, so if this is your first social psychology class, which I imagine it is, you might be uncertain as to how well you're understanding the material. Under those situations where it's sort of uncertain, that's when we look to other people. That's when we compare ourselves to other people. The next obvious question then is, well, who do we compare ourselves to? Now, the answer I have here is that it depends, and we're going to see why it depends in a little bit. But for now, what you need to know is that if you're interested in getting accurate information about yourself, if you really want to know how good you are at something, let's say, then we want to compare ourselves, or we should be comparing ourselves with people who are roughly similar in ability to us. So in other words, if you get a score of 84% on the first exam, you're probably not going to compare yourself to the person who never went to class, who never opened a textbook, who never studied. Obviously, you're going to do better than them, right? So that doesn't give you any information. And you're probably also not going to compare yourself to me and my knowledge of social psychology, because I've taken many classes. I've got a doctorate degree. I've taught this class many times. Of course, I'm going to know more than you in social psychology. You're not going to worry about that. You're going to compare yourself to people who went to about the same number of classes as you, who maybe studied about as hard as you, who roughly does as well as you in other classes at school, right? So we're going to compare ourselves to similar other people if we're interested in accurate information. And the reason I say it depends here is because there are many situations, which we're going to learn about next class, in which we are not interested in getting accurate information about ourselves. And under those conditions, we'll compare ourselves to different types of people. Can't this be harmful when you compare yourself to those above you consistently? That's a question in the chat. It can be both helpful or harmful, depending. There are certain types of social comparison that are helpful. So for instance, if you're trying to do better at something, if you're a basketball player and you compare yourself to LeBron James, right? That might give you something to strive towards. And as a consequence, you might try harder to improve your skills to try to get to his ability. So it can be helpful in that sense. But it can also be harmful in many aspects as well. And in particular, we're going to look at something next class called downward social comparison, which can have both benefits and also can have some drawbacks to it as well. So you're right that social comparison can, under some circumstances, be harmful in various respects. But let's wait to talk about downward social comparison next class so we can see some of that. An important aspect, though, about social comparison theory is that what it shows is that relative information is oftentimes more important than absolute information in terms of how it affects our evaluations of ourselves. Here's what I mean. Let me describe to you a study that looked at this. So in the study, participants were shown different pieces of art, and they had to categorize that art as being drawn, painted by either one artist or another artist, right? So I show you a piece of art, you've got to say, is that this artist or this artist? And you do that a series of times. Okay. Now, at the end of doing this like 10 or 20 times, I go calculate your score, or at least I tell you I'm calculating your score. When I come back to you to tell you what your score is, I'm actually randomly assigning you to be told one of 4 different things. So first off, I tell you either that you got 60% correct or you got 40% correct. Okay, that's totally bogus feedback. It has nothing to do with your actual performance. I'm just randomly telling you got 60% or 40%. That's a manipulation of your absolute level of performance. I also randomly assign you to be told that you either did better than average or worse than average. Okay, that's a manipulation of the relative contribution of information. Okay, so in other words, there's 4 types of people, and people are told they got 40%, which is better than average, 40% worse than average, 60% better than average, 60% worse than average. After being given that feedback, participants then rate themselves in terms of their abilities to differentiate between different artists. Now, what the researchers then looked at is whether those scores that people gave themselves, whether they were influenced by the type of feedback that they got. And what they showed is that it didn't matter if people were told that they got 60% correct or 40% correct. That had no influence on people's self-evaluations. What did have an influence in their evaluations is the relevant information. If people were told they did better than average, people rated themselves really highly. If they were told they did worse than average, they rated themselves really low. In other words, people who were told that they got 40%, which was better than average, rated themselves as better at the task than people who got 60%, but were told it was below average. That's what I mean when I say that relative information, how we compare ourselves to others, outweighs the absolute information about our performance. Okay, so we learn about ourselves, in other words, through the social comparison process. So when you filled in that blank last class, I am, and let's say you said intelligent. The reason, how do you know that you're intelligent? Well, part of the reason that you come to this conclusion that you're intelligent is because compared to other people, you tend to be relatively more intelligent than they are. That's how you've assessed that. What this also means is that I can change the way that you think about yourself, not by changing anything to do with you, but by changing your social environment. So for instance, let's imagine that in high school, you did better than almost all your classmates, right? As a consequence, you develop the self-concept that you're really intelligent because through the social comparison process, you're more intelligent than they are. And then you go to college. And suddenly, the other students in college are on average somewhat more intelligent than the people in high school, right? So now when you're comparing your grades to all your friends' grades, you're not doing as well as they are, perhaps. And now you start concluding, well, if I'm not doing as well as my friends, I guess maybe I'm not as intelligent as I was. Now, what's happened is between high school and college, your intelligence level hasn't actually changed. If anything, it's only gone up, right? But what's happened is that your social comparison group has changed. You were comparing yourself with high school students before, now you're comparing yourself with college students. Because college students are going to be on average somewhat more intelligent, that decreases your own perceptions of your own intelligence. Okay? So we learn about ourselves by constantly comparing ourselves to others. Okay? Or another way of saying this is that the self is defined in relation to others. So let's go back to this question. This is what I asked you at the beginning of class. Would you like to live in a world where you make 50,000, everyone else makes 25,000, or a world in which you make 100,000, everyone else makes 250,000? Let's take a look at how people responded. Now, usually when I ask this question, you get about 60% of people saying option B. Let's just see if you guys replicated that. Oh, look at that. You guys are so predictable. About 60% of people said world B, right? Okay, so if you think about this, this is a little weird. I mean, I think it makes sense why people respond world B, but if we think about the people who responded world A, how does this make sense? I mean, after all, in world A, you only make 50,000, everyone else makes $100,000. Or sorry, I said that wrong. In world A, you make $50,000. In world B, you make $100,000. So why wouldn't you prefer to be in world B where you make twice as much? And if the prices of everything are all the same, which I said that they were because the worlds are identical, you can buy a lot more in world B, right? So why would anyone prefer world A? Well, the answer, now that you know about social comparison, is that because in world A, you make more than everybody else. And in comparison to everyone else, you're doing really good. You love that feeling, right? You're doing better than everyone. In fact, you love that feeling so much, you are willing to sacrifice $50,000 a year for the rest of your life just so you can feel superior to other people, right? To an economist who tend to believe that people behave rationally, this doesn't make any sense, right? To an economist, they would think everyone should prefer world B because that seems more rational. But to a social psychologist, it makes sense why some people would prefer world A, because there is a psychological benefit to feeling as if you're doing better than everybody else. That psychological benefit is so strong. People are willing to sacrifice potentially over 20 years. That's $1 million they're sacrificing. They're willing to sacrifice $1 million over the course of 20 years to feel superior to everybody else. That's a social comparison process. That's how strong social comparison tends to be. Okay. In fact, I can use social comparison to improve, there you go, I should say, about 50% of people overall, when you do this, prefer A. I've noticed among the FIU students I've taught, it's about 60%, or sorry, 40% of people prefer A. It's a little bit different from the general population, but still a significant proportion of people prefer A. In fact, I can use social comparison processes to improve your sex life in 2 minutes. Here's what I'm gonna do. Now follow the logic here, it's pretty easy. There is a bunch of research that has looked at what makes people happy. And there are many factors, of course, that make people happy. But one of the factors that is related to happiness is how much sex people are having. That varies. Some people are happy regardless of how much sex they're having. But on average, the more sex people are having, the happier they tend to be. However, happiness is also related to how much sex you think other people are having. So if you think everyone else is having sex all the time and you're not, you kind of tend to be a little sad about that. If you think no one else is having sex and you're having sex, well, now you'd be really happy, right? That's a social comparison process. We're determining our happiness by comparing ourselves with others. What that means is that there are 2 ways to make you happier with your sex life. One, have more sex. That's the obvious one, right? That's not always so easy. So the second way, though, to make you happier with your sex life is to realize that other people are not having sex as much as you think they are. That will make you happier with your own sex life if you can realize that. Because what happens in the society is that because of TV shows and movies where people are having sex all the time, because that sucks, right? People like watching that. Because of that, people mistakenly believe that other people have way more sex than they're actually having, which makes them unsatisfied with their own sex lives. Once we realize that that perception is wrong, that other people are not having as much sex as is depicted on TV, we become happier with our own sex lives. Okay? Because the happiness with our own sex lives depends on social comparison. And so Tim Wadsworth is a sociologist who did this study. And he makes the following claim: having more sex makes us happy, but thinking that we are having more sex than other people makes us even happier. And so that is how you can use an understanding of social comparison to improve your own sex life in 2 minutes. This social comparison idea, incidentally, has many, many implications. That's partly why it's one of the most famous theories in all of social psychology. Because we can show similar processes as it relates to various emotions that we have as well. So for instance, this was on, I think, the true false quiz that I gave on the first day or second day of class. This refers to a study where people were told they were going to be receiving a shot, an injection. Now, they don't know if this injection is going to hurt. They're kind of in a state of uncertainty. And when we're in a state of uncertainty, and this is a general theme, by the way, that I'm going to repeat over and over in this course in various contexts. When we don't know what the correct behavior is, or we don't know what the correct emotion is that we should be experiencing, the first thing we tend to do is look to other people. What are other people doing? What are other people experiencing? How are they feeling? And we get information that way because of social comparison processes. So when these people are faced with this prospect that they could get this injection and they don't know how painful this is going to be, what do they want to do? They want to look to other people in a similar situation. So in this study, these people who were going to get this injection were told that they were going to have to wait in a waiting room, and they can do so under one of three conditions, and they can choose which one they want. You can either wait alone by yourself. You can wait with another person who's going to be also receiving an injection, or you could be waiting with another person who's not going to be receiving an injection. Which would you prefer? Well, what happens was exactly what's predicted by social comparison theory. People prefer to wait with someone else, but only if that other person was also going to be receiving an injection. Because that person is very similar to them. We want to compare ourselves with similar other people, right? We want to know, is this injection going to hurt? Should I be scared right now? So they look to other people. Well, you're going to receive the injection. Are you scared? If you're scared, then I know I should be scared. If you're feeling calm, I can calm down a little bit. So they prefer to wait with someone who's in the same situation. But waiting with someone who's not going to receive an injection doesn't help you any, because it doesn't give you any information about how you should be feeling. So what that study showed is that nervous people preferred to affiliate with other nervous people because it gave them, through the social comparison process, an idea of how they should be feeling. So, you know, you've heard the saying, misery loves company, right? Well, what the study is suggesting is that that's not entirely true. Misery doesn't just love any kind of company. It loves only other miserable company, because it allows you to socially compare and learn about how you should be feeling. In fact, I can lead people to experience entirely different emotions just by changing people's social environment because of social comparison. Here's how, and this is a classic, this is a really, really famous study in social psychology from the 50s. What they did is this: they brought participants into a lab and they injected them with something that they were told was going to help their eyesight. Now, in reality, that's not what they were injected with. They were injected with adrenaline. And adrenaline basically like increases your physiological arousal. It means it's going to make your heart beat faster. It's going to make you sweaty and jittery. It's going to create that physiological arousal within you. Okay, so what's going on here is that in a few minutes, when this kicks in, these participants are going to feel this emotion that they're not going to have an explanation for it. And as the general rule in social psychology says, when you don't have an explanation for, or if you're if you're feeling uncertain about something, so in this case, you're feeling this arousal and you don't know why, first thing we do is to look to other people. Okay? So while these participants are supposedly waiting for this eye medication, whatever it is, to kick in, they're asked to fill in forms. And they fill in these questionnaires in a room in which there's another person that they are told is also a participant. Now, that participant is actually a confederate, is actually someone working with the experimenter, just pretending to be a participant. And they are told to act in one of two ways. So participants are randomly assigned to be in a room with someone who acts either in a very excited manner or a very angry manner. So let's look at the excited people. So this confederate, this person in the same room filling out forms, starts making jokes while they're filling out forms, right? And there's like a waste paper basket in the corner. So they start scrunching up paper and shooting basketballs like into the waste paper bag or basket. And they start making paper airplanes, and there's a window, and they start throwing them at people outside. And there's a hula hoop, because it's the 1950s, so of course there is. So they start playing with a hula hoop in the middle of the room. And like they're just jumping off the walls, and they're just really excited, right? The other half of the participants are placed in a room with someone, a confederate, who starts behaving really angrily. So this person, as they're going through the questionnaires, starts getting really mad, starts saying like, I can't believe that they're asking us all of this information. And it's a lot of personal information. Like they ask in here, how many affairs my father has had. Like they should not be able to get away with this. And they ask, how many times have you had sex in the past week? That is personal. That's none of their business. And they start getting angrier and angrier and angrier. Now, finally, the researcher comes in and they ask the participant a series of questions, including questions about their mood. So there's two questions in particular. How angry do you feel right now? How excited do you feel right now? That are embedded within a longer questionnaire. Now, what they showed is that among these participants who are in a room with another person who's behaving really excited, they report being really excited themselves. However, for the participants who are in a room with another person who behaved really angry, now the participant themselves reports feeling really angry. What's happened here is that these participants have started to feel the effects of adrenaline, and they have no explanation for why they're feeling this way. So they start looking to their social environment. What are other people experiencing in my environment? Well, this guy is really excited right now. He's bouncing off the walls. So I guess that must mean that I feel excited. Or they start thinking, well, this guy is behaving really angry right now. I guess I must be feeling really angry as well. So what's happened is that these participants experience completely different emotions, despite the fact that they had the exact same physiological response, simply because they were in a different social environment. Okay, so that's how you can create complete opposite emotions just by changing who this person's interacting with. That's not how we normally think about emotions. We think that emotion is something that comes from within. So there's some sort of physiological response that is associated with being sad, and a different physiological response that's associated with being angry, and a different one that's associated with being excited, and et cetera, et cetera. And what this study suggests is that a lot of the emotions that we experience aren't different physiologically, but they're different depending on the social environment we happen to find ourselves in. And so you change someone's environment, you change the complete experience of emotion that they have. And this is all based on social comparison theory. Okay, so that's how we can learn about ourselves, by comparing ourselves with others. But we can also learn about ourselves by thinking about our own behavior. And this is based on something called self-perception theory. This was developed in the 1970s. And this is going to be really, really important later on in the semester. We're going to look at this theory in more depth then. But for now, let me give you the basics of how the theory operates. So let's say that I asked you to tell me, if you think about a friend of yours, what is that friend's favorite type of music? How would you come up with that answer? Well, you'd probably think, well, every time I see them, they're listening to country music. So therefore, their favorite kind of music is probably country music. What you've done is you've formed a rational conclusion based on observation, right? You observe them listening to music, you conclude rationally, of course, they must like country music. Well, in the 1970s, this guy comes along, Daryl Bem, and he says the same way that we do that for other people, that's how we do that for ourselves as well. If I ask you, what is your favorite music? Daryl Bem says that you don't introspect. You don't just go inside yourself and figure out what your favorite music is. You don't have any special information. What happens is that you think about your own past behavior and you come to a rational conclusion based on that past behavior. So in other words, you start thinking, well, every time I drive to work, I listen to country music. So therefore, my favorite music must be country music. The idea here is that you're coming to a rational conclusion based on an observation of your own behavior. That's what self-perception theory says. Okay. Now, again, it's just like social comparison theory, where there's certain things that if your cues are unambiguous, so in other words, you know for a fact that you love heavy metal music, okay, then we don't think about our own past behavior because you already know that the cues are unambiguous. But when the cues are ambiguous, when you're not really sure, we learn about ourselves by thinking about our own past behavior and forming a rational conclusion. This is the opposite of what we normally think, right? So what we normally think is a process whereby we're angry, we have the emotion, or we have the experience, and as a consequence, we engage in behaviors consistent with that experience. We're angry, and therefore we yell. That's the normal way we think about things. What self-perception theory says that sometimes it's the exact opposite. Sometimes what happens is we engage in the behavior first, We yell. And then we come to a conclusion about what we must be experiencing based on our past behavior. We yelled, therefore we conclude we must be angry. Okay, so we learn about ourselves, in other words, by thinking about our own past behavior. And these sorts of ideas that we learn about ourselves by observing ourselves are related to some other phenomena that we've seen in social psychology. So for instance, there's something called the facial feedback hypothesis, which states that changing your facial expression can lead to corresponding changes in mood. So in other words, if I make you smile, that will lead you to become happier. Or if I make you frown, that will lead you to become sadder. This is consistent with the idea that we learn about ourselves by observing our own behaviors, or more specifically, we learn in this case about our emotions by thinking about our facial musculature, basically, how our face is shaped. Let me describe a study that demonstrates this. So to test this idea, what researchers did is they brought people into the lab and they had them watch a short cartoon. And they told them that they had to watch this cartoon under one of two conditions. So for half the participants, they're told that they have to hold a pen in their mouth using only their lips. So to do that, they have to do something like this. What you're basically forced to do is basically put a frown on your face then to hold the pen with only your lips and not your teeth. The other half of the participants are told that while they watch the cartoon, they have to hold a pen in their mouths using only their teeth but not their lips. So they have to do something like this. And that forces people to put a smile on their face, right? So what the researchers have done is they've manipulated whether people have a smile or a frown on their face without actually telling them that's what they're doing. Right? So they all watch this cartoon, then everybody rates how funny they found the cartoons. And what they showed is that people who watched the cartoons with a pen in their mouth using only their teeth, who had a smile on their face, liked the cartoons more, found them funnier than people who watched the same cartoons holding a pen with only their lips, who had a frown on their face. Okay? In other words, their facial musculature changed their emotion. If they smiled, they were happier. If they were frowning, they were sadder. It's the basic idea. There's research that shows that this can be true with posture as well. So a simple study that looked at this had people fill out questionnaires at a table that was either too high or too low for them. So if the table's too high, people had to sit up really straight to do it. If the table's too low, they had to bend over to do it. They then gave people a questionnaire which included questions like, how proud do you feel right now? And the people who had a minute ago been filling out a questionnaire at a table that was too high for them, like this, reported feeling prouder because they're up close or they're up straight, compared to people who are slouched over, which is more a posture that's related to being dejected, right? So the idea here is that changing your posture can also lead to a corresponding change in mood, which is again sort of consistent with self-perception theory, that we learn about ourselves by observing our, in this case, our posture, our past behavior. Okay. A fourth factor, a fourth way that we can come to know about ourselves. So we looked at introspection, we looked at observing other people's behavior versus social comparison, we looked at observing our own behavior versus self-perception. Another way that we learn about ourselves is through culture. Because the culture in which you are raised in and the culture in which you are in right now changes the way that we think about ourselves in fundamental ways. And I kind of alluded to this last class when I told you that people fill in the I am blank phrase with different responses depending on which culture they come from. And I had mentioned that people from Western cultures like this one tend to fill that in with personality characteristics. I'm intelligent, I'm generous, whatever. People from Eastern cultures like Korea, Japan, and China tend to fill that in very differently. Typically with group affiliations. I'm a brother, I'm a sister, I'm part of this group, etc. And the ways in which they fill in that question represent fundamental differences in how people from these two different cultures perceive themselves. Now, instead of Western and Eastern cultures, we're going to call them individualist and collectivist cultures. So individualist cultures are what we think of as Western. So the United States, Canada, Western Europe. Collectivist cultures tend to be more Eastern cultures like China, Japan, Korea, etc. Okay. So as I said, people with an individualist orientation tend to respond with trait descriptions, and you guys pretty much all did this as well. People with a collectivist orientation respond with group affiliations. And again, this is not some superficial difference. This represents a deep underlying difference in the ways that people think about themselves across these two different cultures. And in other words, how we think about ourselves is determined by the culture in which we were raised or in which we are now. Had you been raised in a more Eastern culture, you would probably have responded very differently to this question on Tuesday, because you would have thought about yourself very differently than you think about because of the culture that you find yourself in. But these are such fundamental differences that we don't even realize this, right? We don't realize that the culture we're in is shaping the way that we think about ourselves, because you feel as if the way that you think about yourself is just a natural thing to do. That's how ingrained it is, right? But it's not natural, it's partly culturally based. So let's talk about some of the differences between these two cultures. In individualist cultures, like this one, we have what's known as an independent self-concept. That means that if I ask you to describe yourself in a vacuum, you could easily do so, right? You think of yourself as a collection of personality traits. So you could easily describe yourself in a vacuum. That's not a problem. You exist independently of other people, in other words. But in a collectivist culture, that question doesn't make so much sense. If I ask them to think about themselves in a vacuum, it doesn't really make sense to them because they don't think of themselves that way. They think of themselves as being very interdependent and connected with other people. And so asking them to take them out of that sort of social context doesn't make sense, because they have what's known as an interdependent self-concept. They define themselves, they think about themselves in relation to other people, in other words. So in individualist cultures, because of this independent self-concept, a lot of our identity is based on our personal goals and our personal achievements. You define yourself in part by what you've accomplished in the past and what you want to do in the future and the goals you want to attain in the future. But it's your sort of personal achievements that tend to define you in this culture. In collectivist cultures, though, identity is based less on individual achievements and goals and more on the social groups that you belong to. You are defined in relation to the groups that you're a part of. And that's why if you ask people from collectivist cultures to fill in that statement, I am blank, they tend to respond with these social group affiliations, because that is an inherent part of their self-identity. And because of this, in individualist cultures, people are encouraged to validate the self. So for instance, let's say that you want to become a doctor, but your family wants you to become a lawyer. In this culture, we encourage people to do what they want to do, right? If you want to become a doctor and your family wants you to become a lawyer, become a doctor. You are the choice. You make the choice for yourself, right? That's what I mean when I say they're encouraged to validate the self in this culture. In collectivist cultures, they're not encouraged to validate the self in that way. In fact, they're often encouraged to restrain their own self-interests in order to fit in with the larger groups. So if they want to become a doctor, but their family wants them to become lawyers, culturally, they might be encouraged to override what they want and to do what their family wants and to become a lawyer. They might even think it's selfish to do what you want to do and to not consider what your family wants for you. And so in individualist cultures, we tend to disapprove of conformity. Now, turns out that we conform all the time in this culture. We're going to see that when we look at conformity. But we don't like to think that we do, right? We have negative terms for people who conform, like sheep and lemmings. We don't like conformity in this culture. In collectivist cultures, they are much more likely to approve of conformity. They disapprove of egotism, of going against the trend. They would say that conformity is a good thing because it's leading you to fit in with other people. It's like a social lubricant that allows you to get along with other people really well. And so conformity is perceived as a very positive thing in collectivist cultures. Even the sayings that we have in these cultures differ. So in Western cultures, we have sayings like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In other words, if you stand out, that's a good thing because good things will come to you. The grease will come to you, right? So standing out is a good thing. But in collectivist cultures, they have kind of opposite sayings. They have one that translates to the nail that stands out gets pounded down. If you stand out too much, we're going to make sure you fit in again. You have to conform to society. So the way in which you think about yourself, and in particular, the idea that you're just a collection of personality traits, is very much tied to the culture, this Western culture, that I presume you were raised in. And so the culture affects the self in many, many different ways. It affects our fundamental view of the self. So for instance, Westerners like ourselves, or individual people from individualist cultures, we tend to see ourselves as more unique than Easterners because we like that. We like the idea of being unique. It's sort of threatening to think that we conform and just go along with other people, right? We'd like to stand out. Whereas to Easterners, to collectivist, people from collectivist cultures, they like the idea of fitting in. They don't like the idea of being unique because that makes them stand out and they're kind of uncomfortable with that. So we tend to view ourselves as more unique than Eastern people. It can also affect the ways that with which we express emotion. So in Western cultures, we tend to express more emotions that are related to our ego. And when I say the word ego, I don't mean that in a negative way in terms of like pride. What I mean is that these motivations have, or sorry, these emotions have as an underlying motivation. They satisfy some individualistic need that we have. So for instance, if we think about the emotion of jealousy, which is basically the fear of losing something that you have, that's a very ego-focused emotion, meaning we have the emotion because we're afraid of losing something ourselves. It's very focused on the self, right? Or if you take something like pride, being proud of your own accomplishments, that's pride in yourself, right? So the basic underlying foundational motivations of these emotions is very much focused on the self. We experience more of those emotions than people from Eastern cultures because they're less focused on the self in that sense. On the other hand, in Eastern cultures, they have emotions that we don't even have words for in this culture. So there's an emotion that translates roughly to the feeling of being indebted to someone, the feeling of owing someone something. And note that that emotion is focused on the interconnections between people. It's not focused on just one person's individual emotions, right? It's the interconnectedness, because that's how they think about themselves, as being interconnected to those people. So again, what we're seeing is that emotions are not an inherent biological thing. Emotions are affected by the environment which we find ourselves through social comparison process, as we saw before. They're also tied to the culture that we're a part of, because that changes the fundamental way in which you see yourself and therefore the emotions that you experience. Furthermore, the culture that we're a part of affects the way that we strive for status. So I kind of alluded to this, where in Western cultures, our status derives from personal achievement and the goals that we've accomplished. Whereas Easterners tend to derive status in terms of group achievement. It's less important how the individual did and more important how the group or the team did as a whole. And because of it, because they focus on the interconnections between people. And because of this, what this means is that Westerners, much more than Easterners, are biased when recalling their individual contribution to a team's success. For instance, you can take a basketball game. Let's say you had 5 players and they've just won a game, and you separate them after the game and you ask each person individually, how much did you contribute to your team's win? 25%, 50%, whatever. And they each give you a number. And if you add up all those numbers, they almost always add up to more than 100%, meaning people are overestimating their individual contribution to the team's success. Now, if you do the same thing with Easterners, you take 5 people and you separate them and ask them, how much did you contribute to your team's win? Typically, if you then add up all those numbers, they equal less than 100%, meaning people, if anything, are not taking credit for their contributions. If anything, they're backing off because what's important to them is not their individual performance, it's the team performance. And they are much more willing to sacrifice sort of individual achievement as long as the group is able to succeed. So just to summarize this section then, there's 2 things to take away. First off is that we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. We think we know ourselves really well because we introspect, right? And we think that we have privileged access to this special information. And hopefully I've made the case based on some studies that we discussed that we don't have any special, or a lot of the time, we don't have special information about ourselves. That oftentimes when we come up with reasons for why we do something, why we feel a certain way, why we prefer one thing over another, we're simply relying on common sense ideas. And a lot of the time, our explanations are completely incorrect. So we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And the second main takeaway from this section is that our self-concept, how we think about ourselves, is not completely stable. It varies from situation to situation. So I talked about how in high school, you might have thought yourself as really intelligent, then you come to college and you think of yourself as somewhat less intelligent. Not because your intelligence has actually changed, but because you're defining yourself in relation to different groups of people. And so our self-concept, not being stable, it changes from situation to situation. And it's therefore not really objective, right? You can vary it in a number of different ways. And it's influenced by all sorts of factors. In fact, you can even show this within a single individual. So I'll just mention one thing and I'll let you go. So for instance, there's a study that looked at people who were born in Korea and spent like 10 or 20 years there and came to the States. So they were born in a collectivist culture and they lived in an individualist culture. And if you have them fill in the I am blank, if you write that in English, they tend to respond in ways that are indicative of individualist Western thinking with personality traits. But if you ask them that in Korean, they tend to respond in more collectivist orientations by highlighting their social connections with others. In other words, within the same person, you can invoke different aspects of their self-concept just by changing, for instance, the language in which you ask these questions. That's what I mean when I say self-concept is not stable, but it's influenced by all these factors. Okay, I'm sorry, I kind of rushed the last few minutes there because I wanted to make sure to get done before the end of class, so I apologize for that. We are going to pick up here next class. Remember that the exam is 1 week from today, so consider starting to study relatively soon. And I will see you guys next week. Have a great weekend. Bye.